Welcome to First in Fiction, your first stop for learning to write better fiction. I'm Aaron Gansky, author of the Hand of Adonai series, The Bargain, and Firsts in Fiction.
And I'm Heather Luby, the managing editor of the Citron Review.
So for those of you watching on YouTube, you're noticing some two very good-looking people popping up on your screen, but not moving. We have disabled our cameras tonight for a variety of reasons. Mine is, I actually left my computer at work today, so I don't have it with me, and I'm borrowing a computer to cast on tonight. The webcam's not quite as sharp. And Heather, you've been busy today.
Yeah, I had one of those days where I think at this point I've been up about 19 hours with all my typical things I handle in the day, but plus sadly, a very sick puppy who's been at the emergency vet a couple of times, and I've been tending to her and thought it might be best not to scare off what viewers might be joining us tonight
Uh, yeah, yeah,
by
that
sharing what
makes
I look
sense.
like on, like 2.5, 3 hours of sleep.
Right. Yeah, I've been there. I've been there. So luckily I've only been up for like 17 hours, so I'm like 2 hours fresher than you.
So you're downright refreshed.
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, it's been a while since you've been on. Your schedule has been rather full. So, what have you been up to these days?
It's been the typical thing for a lot of parents this time of year. I've got two kids. I have a 5-year-old daughter and a daughter who actually just turned 9 yesterday. So the last
Very
several weeks has
nice.
just been, I know, right?
Yeah.
But it's really been about getting them settled into school. We had two family vacations. We actually spent the Labor Day weekend in Chicago. We were up there almost 5 days
Wow.
with the family. And so it's just been sort of about getting, my own school year with my kids off to a good start, getting them settled, getting ready for my own teaching duties. For those of you who don't know, I'm also a part-time instructor with St. Louis Community College in creative writing. So I have some classes starting soon as well.
Excellent. Yeah. So a lot of prep work there. Same for me. Classes started up, so I've got my students in full swing, and teaching. I teach AP English, American literature, and so I get these students coming in at they want to talk books. What have you read? What have you read? And so last year the hot topic was The Fault in Our Stars, and this year it's If I Stay, which I haven't had a chance to read. But these kids all came in as juniors in high school. They read Crime and Punishment last year, and so when we were talking about the Scarlet Letter at the beginning of the year, they started making some connections between Crime and Punishment and the Scarlet Letter, and I felt a little bit out of my league since I hadn't read Crime and Punishment yet. So I quickly put that on my to-read list, and I started that. And
For some light summer reading.
I think really what it boils down to is that's why I'm so tired tonight, is because I tried reading that. So um, that'll take you out of it real fast.
Like I think I mentioned this to you earlier that I read that years ago. Kind of undertook um, a bit of a reading project with my husband where we read Crime and Punishment. We read The Sound and the Fury by William Faulkner. We
Hmm.
just, I think, put together like a stack of books that we felt like we somehow should have read and that we
Right.
might have lied about having read before in the past.
Right. Right.
And so we went ahead and tried to read them.
Yeah.
I got to spend my summer. I actually read The Fault in Our Stars this summer, so I was a little behind the curve.
I read it last year too. Did you enjoy it?
I did. I don't often read YA. I mean, overall, I can say that I've read obviously like the Harry Potter series. I read the Hunger Games. I never read
Hmm.
Twilight.
Good.
And in
Good call.
general, in general, I don't read a lot of YA because I feel like my own sensibilities for writing maybe run a little dark, which might be if I guess if I'm drawn to YA, why I like something like the Hunger Games.
Right. Did you
But
read
I enjoyed.
Did you read the Divergent series?
I did not, mainly because my niece is a ferocious reader,
Hmm.
quite a bright young girl, and she loved the first book. I think she enjoyed the second book, and then was distressed and completely hated the third book. And it put me off reading the series because I sort of felt like, well, if the third book was going to be that big of a disappointment to me, and I kind of knew it in advance, that
Right.
I didn't even want to undertake it.
No, I hear you on that. I read the first one. Wasn't super impressed with it. It's not a very popular opinion to hold because the first one was so wildly popular and had a great um, kind of dramatic setup, but the writing kind of left something to be desired on my end, so I wasn't a super big fan. But I have heard a lot of, like you say, fans of the series that are disappointed in book three. I could say the same thing for Hunger Games, though. I thought book three was didn't have the resolve that I was hoping for. But it's
I
hard when
think
you have a
overall,
series like that.
yeah, I think overall I'm sort of disappointed with this idea that, at least in terms of film, that has been the way things are going lately, where you have these book series, they want to make them into movies, they're trying to make the most money from the movies as possible, so they take books and like the last book of the Hunger Games, right, and they're making it into two movies,
Right. Yeah.
which to me, like I said, just seems more like that's driven by wanting to make more money, not by I think what the book would demand of a making of a movie.
Yeah. I don't think book three of the Hunger Games really demanded two movies. The seventh Harry Potter, I could
I
understand
could
that,
see that. I could understand that.
but
But yeah, this I did not love. It's sort of like I didn't love the idea of making The Hobbit
into three films.
into three films.
Yeah. Oh, Peter Jackson. You gotta
Did you
love Peter Jackson.
you know what book I just finished? Literally finished it last night.
What's
And
that?
I know it's kind of a buzz right now because the movie is coming out, I think, just in about 10 days or so. I just finished reading This Is Where I Leave You by Jonathan Troper.
I don't even know if I've heard of it.
Oh, yeah. I guess it came out last year. The movie is coming out next week. It has Jason Bateman in it, Timothy Oliphant, Rose Byrne, Tina Fey.
Oh, is it kind of a comedy?
Well, it is, but
I
it's
may
a
have seen.
very, very, I would say, like a very dark comedy drama.
Okay, a dramedy.
Yeah, it's very much the type of book where I might be laughing at something and simultaneously felt like I could cry, that I felt guilty for laughing, and then thought it was hysterical and thought I could cry.
Okay, yeah, I think I've seen the previews, and the film looked kind of intriguing to me. I saw Guardians of the Galaxy over the weekend with my wife, so that was fun. That was
Oh,
very literary, as you can tell.
nope, I can tell you, I want to see that so badly.
It's fun. It's fun. Uh, it was definitely fun. So
I love Chris Pratt.
yeah, I haven't seen him in much. I don't watch a ton of TV. I don't see a ton of movies. You know what I did this summer? I know we're totally off topic. We'll get to topic. Sorry, guys. Um, I made it a point to watch like the worst comic book movies ever made.
Hmm.
Um, and so, Daredevil and Elektra were my first two choices, and they were bad, but they weren't like so bad like everybody says. And then I watched Ghost Rider, which really lived up to my
That's a Nick
super
Cage
low
movie, isn't
expectation.
it? That's Nicolas Cage, right?
Yeah, and I mean
Yeah.
anything that he's kind of like the reverse, what is it, King Midas? He's got the reverse King Midas touch. Anything he touches turns to something other than gold. So,
Which is so funny because, early on that was not the case for him. I mean, he had quite an era of being the it guy for action movies.
yeah. Yeah, and then I think people realize, well, I mean, same thing with Keanu Reeves, right? Like at some point he was pretty to look at, I think is what it boiled down to. So it got a lot of girls into the theater, but I don't know. They're not exactly the greatest actors I've ever seen. So, all right. Well, should we get started, you think?
Yeah, we can go ahead and get started.
Yeah. I just kind of feel like our audience is kind of like, when are we going to talk about
Yeah,
writing?
before we descend into a conversation about Nicolas Cage.
Yeah, exactly. Like we are so far away from writing right now. Oh man, hopefully your manuscripts are better than Nicolas Cage's acting. So, and I'm sure they are. So, what I thought we might do tonight, and this was kind of by popular demand, one of the viewer suggestion or listener suggestion, was kind of a review of some popular, I guess, writing terms. These are terms that Heather and I use often when we are critiquing manuscripts, when we're working with students, things that we talk about when we teach our classes. And we see them so often that we kind of take for granted that everybody understands them. But that's not always the case, and sometimes we have to remind ourselves, it's probably going to be good to like define some of these terms and what we're talking about and what we mean. So we just put together a quick list, and I'm going to go ahead and kick it over to Heather. Let Heather, I'm going to let you tackle the first one here, which is just simply point of view or POV.
Right. I mean, and that's honestly a pretty simple one. I think the reason we decided to include it on the list is because in teaching, we're often using sort of a shorthand for a lot of common, whether it be common phrases or concepts in
Uh huh.
writing. And I sort of realized when I was teaching, I was often referring to POV this, POV that, um, until I started noticing that, I had these little tiny hands in the back, right? Excuse me. Can you please tell me what POV is? I was sort of taking for granted, maybe because of um, the amount of like books on the craft of writing, whether it's our MFA program, that everybody understood that that was point of view.
Right.
So, and point of view, of course, is the angle from which the writer is writing their piece, particularly in fiction. So it's like point of view is when we're referring to something being in first person or third person. But like I said, and a lot of times if I'm writing on a paper and if I'm giving a lecture, I'm just going to refer to it as the POV of the story.
Yeah, I use it a lot when I'm denoting POV slips, and that's something that I notice a lot, or point of view slips, where we'll go into, we're in third person close, but we slip into somebody else's point of view for a minute. We get into somebody else's mind, and so I've got it. I highlight it and I go POV slip or shift or something like that, and then I'll get some questions on that. Well, what do you mean, and how do you know it's in their point of view? And well, I mean, you're telling the story from Jack's point of view, and all of a sudden we're inside Sally's head. So like that's a little bit of a shift. And that's how I generally use the term when I'm critiquing things and when I'm giving feedback. I might also suggest a different point of view. Try first person, try second person, etc. And there are definite, I don't want to call them rules, but there are definite reasons why you would pick one point of view over the other. We've done in the past, if you go through kind of our archives, we've done a couple different casts on point of view. So if you're interested in that, and you still feel like you don't have quite the grasp on it that you want, I'd encourage you to kind of flip back through some of our older posts until you find the point of view ones. Hopefully on the show notes, I'll remember to actually give you some links back to those. But no promises. I'm lucky to be awake right now.
It's a little late.
Yeah, and it's later for you than for me, so. Tone is another one, and tone refers to, you know, how would you define this one, Heather? How would you say? Because I know how I
Well,
define it, but I'm not sure it's exactly how you would define it.
well, I think if we're going to be really particular in terms of a complete definition, I can tell you I'm looking at a definition for tone right now, and it says that tone is the author's implicit attitude toward the reader or the people, places, and events in a work as revealed by the elements of the author's style. Now that's kind of a mouthful, right? And
Right.
with tone, I often feel like in a way that it's more closely related to style. Oftentimes when we're writing, I might be referring to a tone of a piece or a mood of a piece, but I think tone and mood can be slightly different. And tone for me is more a product of the author's writing style.
Okay.
And yeah, so you go from there.
Yeah, tone, coming from kind of the more a nonfiction standpoint, tone is generally the definition I give is the author's attitude toward his or her subject, how they feel about what it is that they're covering. Kind of, I mean, if you want to look for things like bias, etc. But in fiction, I think the best fiction usually kind of the author is a little more removed, and the author is able to present a story without making judgments on their characters. Um, but no matter how hard you try, you're still going to have a particular bias as a fiction writer. And the way you present your characters and what they're doing, you are either championing them or you are in some way judgmental or critical of them. And I think that really plays out more in the mood of the piece, as you said, Heather. I think we notice it more in the mood and the emotional context, I guess, of a scene. Does that make sense?
It does. Like when I think mood, I mean, I do often think in terms of more of the atmosphere of the piece, which includes things like word choices and setting and so forth. When I think tone, which of course is also can be conveyed through, details and descriptions, I more often think about stylistically the type of writing. And then again, as you said, how the author is sort of treating the subject matter for which they are writing. I think one of the things that I point out a lot, if I'm going to mention tone at all to a student, say if I'm looking over some of their work, a lot of times it comes to mind when I see that there's inconsistencies in the tone. When maybe someone, from start to finish in a story, um, I feel like the tone of the piece that was set in the beginning or with the opening lines is not sustained throughout the piece. And it isn't so much a deliberate act as just someone who's maybe not sure of the tone of which they're choosing for their piece yet, the style of their writing, and it becomes obvious.
Yeah, so you might say like reading one page, reading, one scene feels different than reading another scene. It's almost as if you're reading two scenes written by separate people.
Absolutely. It's like I'm looking for places in, say a story or a novel or so forth, where the tone is either fading or shifting in what is sort of an inconsistent manner, something that's not serving the narrative of the piece.
Okay, I got you. And I like that you say that. That's something else that we talk about is serving the narrative of the piece. And I, the term that we like to throw around is whether or not something is earned. And I think things are earned, quote unquote, earned when you have things that precede them that serve the narrative. So what am I talking about here? This would be if you've got a scene, we talk about killing your darlings. If you've got a scene that's not furthering the plot, that's not moving things forward, that's not developing character in some way, um, it's kind of it's they're blank pages is what they are. They're not serving the narrative, as Heather said. And I think um, the opposite is also true. If we get to the ending, and this is normally when you hear the term, this wasn't earned. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
when you get to an ending that's not quote unquote earned, what we're saying is you didn't set this up properly. This change is not believable. I think of a story I read from a student, and in it, somebody says, "Oh, you should call the police," and the other character says, "Call the police? What are you crazy? I can't call the police." And then they spend 3 pages talking about why they can't call the police. And the next line is, "My friend convinced me to call the police." And I went, "What? What? Well, how? When? When did that? I don't. Did I miss? Am I missing pages?" I went back and checked. Am I missing pages? Um, that line, that decision on the part of the character was not earned because it was not set up. There were not things in the story that were serving to develop that character that would make you believe that this character, though she's originally opposed to calling the police, would break down in this particular position, in this particular situation, and actually call the police. So that, I mean, anything from character decisions to the ending of a novel, um, the payout that we talk about. Sometimes we get these great grandiose ideas of how we want to end the book, but we don't bother setting up the ending properly, or we haven't done it enough. And so that's generally what we mean when something is not earned.
I absolutely agree. And while not different, I mean, while I should say is while not exactly the same, what this brings to mind to me, and I'm throwing in a word that is not on your list, I don't believe, but is melodrama. Because when
Yeah.
we're talking about whether something is earned or not, um, melodrama is something I point out a lot in pieces when I am giving critiques, like in my workshops and things like that. That people, to be fair, I think sometimes people just get, I don't know, I don't want to say lazy, but I want to say tired. Maybe they don't know quite where to go with something or what to do with it, and it seems an easy way out to have characters really overreact in situations, and that there be
Hmm.
huge displays of drama. They can be very over the top. And what's interesting to me is that students often misconstrue that when I'm calling something melodrama, I'm not saying that you can't have a character that does something huge, that can
Right.
might do something um, big grand gestures. We all love novels where very extraordinary things happen. So it's not that I'm saying that you can't have something that almost feels like exaggerated in terms of plot and characters, but it like to use the phrase you just used, right? But it needs to feel like it's earned. It still has to come from not just a believable place, but you need to have been laying the groundwork where I feel like whatever has happened or whatever emotions a character is displaying, that they are, I hate to keep using the word earned, but
Yeah.
they are believable for that character.
Yeah. I feel like we could probably do an entire podcast on this particular aspect of earning something and how you can earn something and get that payout that you want. I'll give a couple quick examples. I say quick. I don't know that they're actually going to be quick, but um, this is. I remember doing a Bible study some years ago on the book of John, and the Gospel of John, and what really struck me, because I've read it several times, I've read the Bible several times, but what really struck me in that is the fact that from birth, Jesus is actively working toward his death. Every step that he takes, every word that he says, is setting himself up for crucifixion, and he knows it, and he knows it, and understanding that, understanding the ending, where he eventually ends up. Um, Reading that book takes on a whole different tone. If we go back to that previous thing, this tone of, gee, he could have easily escaped here and here and here and here, and yet he doesn't. And here, they wanted to crucify him early, but he slipped away because it wasn't his time. And here, they couldn't crucify him, even if they wanted to, but he says this particular thing, which, legally means, he's basically signing his own death warrant. Um, and that kind of got me thinking about this idea of knowing the end. As the readers, or sorry, as the writers, we know the end, and we need to earn it. Our characters need to be, from page one, actively working toward the end of the novel. I read a book that somebody's writing a manuscript, and in it, somebody, the protagonist's sister dies, and he's distraught, and he's broken up, and there's, pages and pages of tears. And my comment was, I don't really feel bad. I didn't know this sister. I feel like a terrible person saying I don't care that your sister is dead, but at some point, where is she? Where is the sister? Where are the moments, the interactions, with the sister, that are going to make me, the reader, feel this sorrow? Because when you have a character that's feeling something that the reader doesn't feel, that's where we start to think melodrama, right?
Exactly. And it feels empty and you're losing that opportunity for connection. I know that Leonard Chang, who I know we've mentioned before as being, a mentor and a writer that was in our MFA program,
Mm-hmm.
some of the best advice he ever gave me when he was helping me with some early drafts of my novel was that I was trying to write this novel about grief, about this husband losing his wife in a very brutal, violent way, and all that he was feeling. And I was really concentrating, like you said, on those emotions and on those feelings. And I thought I was writing them beautifully. And eventually, Leonard said to me, he's like, "We can't have a sense of what he has lost, or what it feels like for him, this loss, um, if we never knew her in the first place." So that's what sort of prompted me to go back through, right, and layer it with images and scenes and background of her when she was alive. Because we can't know what he's lost if we, in fact, never have any appreciation of what they were like together.
And that's something I mentioned, I believe, to him as well, and to some other students. Um, my advice to the gentleman who wrote this manuscript was, you need to, when you go back through and you write these scenes with the sister, you have to understand that she is a corpse. She's a walking corpse. And I know that's kind of like dark, but that's the way you have to think about it, is, that she's dead eventually, and so you want to set it up to where we feel it, that payout in the end. Um,
Yeah, you're laying that groundwork for your reader.
exactly. And kind of what you're talking about, I've mentioned this to some other writers, is developing character through the absence of another, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, especially in cases of loss, like you're talking about loss and grief. Um, something simple like there's still a half a pot of coffee left. That's she normally drinks that half, or whatever the case is. To where the small mundane things that are different develops not only the character's absence, but the sense of loss that the character who's present is going through. And that develops both the character who's gone and the character who's there on stage.
Right. It's those opportunities, like you said, to use those tiny examples to really illustrate and draw out a character who may not even physically be in the room, may not even still be alive, right?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So,
Yeah, we could go on and on, I'm sure,
yeah.
just about that alone. What's another one of our words that we were wanting to discuss?
I feel like a few of these we could do pretty rapid fire. So, one that some of the terms that's thrown around a lot in critique groups is RUE, which stands for resist the urge to explain. This comes across, and depending on the writer that you're working with or the editor that you're working with, they'll say the same thing in different ways. I say trust the reader, and the reason I say that is because that's what one of my mentors, Rob Robert, used to say to me often, a lot, like 3 times a page. We get it. We've picked it up. Um, you're just being redundant now. And it was tough for me because, as a beginning writer, I want to make sure that my readers are picking up the points. And Rob's point to me was, we're getting the points, dude. We're not dumb. Like, just trust your writing and trust the reader to pick up what you're putting down. When you don't, I always give the example of the book I read in which, the sentence was, he was almost happy, period, almost, period. And I'm like, I just read that word in the previous sentence. It's the same word. And almost is not a complete sentence on its own. Like, it's almost insulting as a reader when you're repetitive to that degree. I don't know if you feel the same way, but I know as a beginning writer, I did this all the time. I still catch myself doing it where I say something more than I need to.
Mm-hmm.
And it takes a lot of confidence to take a step back and say, uh, they've just answered this question 3 times in different ways. They only need one answer. I'm going to cut the other two.
It's interesting, and I cannot find the quote for the life of me in case anybody hears me like click clacking on my computer in the background, because it is a terrific quote by Annie Dillard. But talking about the same type of thing, and she calls it like the 1-2 step or something. And sorry that I can't find it, but essentially it's what you're saying, that people have, and we all have it as writers, right? This
Mm-hmm.
just compelling urge when we're writing to say something, and then to follow it up with a second sentence that is essentially almost a restatement of what came right before, as if we're needing to knock our readers over the head to be like, just making sure you got it. I'm saying it, 2 different ways,
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
um, just to make sure you get it. And like you said, that in a way is insulting to your reader, at best, right? And at worst, it's such a disservice to yourself as a writer in your writing because it is not as clean, as crisp, um, as it
Yes.
could be when it's full of those type of repetitious lines.
Yes. Less is more. We beginning writers think that repetition is emphasis, and really it's overkill. Um, and it takes a lot of time to develop that skill and that confidence in your writing to pull back and to remember less is more. And it's a tired cliche, but it's no less true. Um, that control. You want to know that you're in the hands of a master. You want to know you're in the hands of somebody who trusts their writing and that they trust you as a reader. And that's a beautiful thing. When you read a book like that and you pick up on those subtleties, super rewarding as a reader. You just want to read everything they write down um, because it's just so incredibly satisfying. Whereas the repetition, where you're not trusting the reader, oftentimes it comes across as didactic, which is another one of these terms that we
Yes,
throw
it
around.
is.
And it's preachy, it's soapbox. It turns into a soapbox at some point. And the term that we use at the Citron Review, I think I coined this term. I'm going to go ahead and take credit, even if I didn't. But crowbar fiction, right? Where you have
Right.
a point that you want to make, and you're going to beat me over the head with a crowbar until I get it. Please spare me the crowbar. I just need it once, and I'm fine. That's all I need. Um, and that's a piece that's referred to as didactic. That's really what it is. It stems from this not trusting the reader.
Right, if feeling like that you have to be this informative, you're the informational, um, the teller of everything. What's interesting about you sort of bringing that up, and how I'm going to combine some of these terms we're talking about, is that I think that I run across it oftentimes because I have students who, not that it can't appear in genre fiction, which again, for those of you who are thinking genre fiction, that's going to be things like mysteries, science fiction, romance, works that sort of fit a little bit more neatly into these categories.
Hmm.
Um, I think the reason why we see a lot of this at the Citron Review is we're sort of known for being literary flash fiction.
Yeah.
And if you just go and you Google, say, literary fiction, Wikipedia is going to tell you that literary fiction is something that sort of is a deliberate commentary on social issues or political issues, or focuses on exploration of the human condition, right?
Hmm.
That it's more about theme than on plot and all these sorts of things. So while I think that sometimes you have a writer who wants to give way too much information in terms of maybe historical context or how a machine works, a lot of times that sort of informative fiction, that didactic fiction that you're talking about, is really coming about because I think people are, as you said, getting on a soapbox. They're trying to write a piece that has a social bent, a political bent, um, and it becomes more about preaching to you that their point of view on a topic than allowing the story to work for them.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah,
So
well
sort of
said.
throwing in genre fiction, literary fiction, and your term all together in one ball.
That was really impressive how you did that. Don't think I didn't notice, because I noticed that.
Well, in case you didn't notice, that's why I went ahead and told you.
Yeah, you really weren't trusting the listener there. And it feels like you took a crowbar to my head to point out that your genius there. Um, so absolutely. So I think actually that's most of it. There's a couple more that I wanted to touch on just real
Sure.
briefly, and I think this one's super important. It's called Upping the Stakes, and it's something that I heard first in um, oh man, my beginning creative fiction writing class at Cal State San Bernardino.
Hmm.
Great class. I learned so much there. And she kept talking about upping the stakes, upping the stakes. And the idea is, um, things in your story should go from bad to worse. Uh, there should be something on the line. When there's some stakes in the game. They characters stand to lose something is how I like to phrase it. What is it that the characters stand to lose? If at first it's their job and then it's their wife and then it's their life, we are upping the stakes. We are showing a natural progression of events, and the tension is growing, the conflict is growing, until we get to kind of this boiling over point. It doesn't have to be so dramatic, especially in literary fiction. You're generally not going to see that. Um, I'll give a great example though. Is oh man, Remember Me This Way by Brett Anthony Johnston. It's been like 3 weeks since I mentioned his name, so I got it back
So
in
we want to
there
get that in there.
at least once a month. I'm gonna have him on the show eventually. I should probably contact him and let him know.
He's going to
So
be on here at some point.
yeah, exactly. Just so you know, by the way, I scheduled you. So, um, but in it, I don't know if you're familiar with the book or not, Heather, but a kid is kidnapped and the family's trying to move on with their life, or actually just get through their life. But the interesting thing is, the book really begins after he returns. The kid's name is Justin. He's been gone for I think 3 years, and it starts after his return. And so what are the stakes right now? Because well, he's home, but our lives have been shattered, and we've just learned, we've adjusted over these last 3 years to live life without him, and now we have to adjust to live life with him. And while it's great and wonderful, it's far from an easy transition, and it really plays havoc with the family. And you see a lot of the inner turmoil, and a lot of the distance that has grown between them, and this, the feelings of guilt and remorse, etc. So what's on the line is not their lives; it's their livelihood, and that continues as the kidnapper is arrested, as the kidnapper is released. No spoiler alerts, but as things continue, those stakes are raised.
Right. And I think essentially as a writer, that's what you're looking to do is intensify the main problem of your story. You want to make your readers worry. Their worry for your character is essentially what gets them turning the pages. And you
Right.
can up the stakes by a couple of different ways. You can up the stakes by creating barriers for your character. So, a barrier might be something that occurs when a character is trying to do something that doesn't work, right? An action is stopped for a moment. What will the character do to sort of get around this barrier? You can up the stakes by complications, which are more like action points that don't pay off immediately, right?
Mhm.
Your hero may be busy with the main plot line, but all of a sudden, you throw in a subplot and some type of new element or character or conflicts that gets dropped into the mix that just complicates everything.
Right.
Um, so, there's different ways that you can up the stakes in a piece, but essentially it's all about creating that tension and that worry in your reader. And like you said, it doesn't have to be in when people hear the words conflict, for instance. I think we've talked about this in previous podcasts. I mean, they're certainly thinking that things have to be big.
Hmm.
And you don't necessarily have to up the stakes by, having someone kidnapped, but
Right.
but you have to up the stakes in a way that makes your reader worry and that is consistent with the tone of your work. See how I threw that in there?
Hey, full circle there.
Full
I got it.
circle.
Try not to be too didactic though. So excellent. Yeah, so that's called upping the stakes. And then the last one that I thought we might cover tonight is beats, Beats. And this is a term, I think we use it in largely the same way, but I think we use it at different points. And it's interesting to me, we were talking a little bit about this before the show, that you ask for action beats. So if you don't mind, just a little bit about what you mean by action beats.
Well, an action beat to me, and for all I know, like I'm, using a word incorrectly because I think I was recently reading Jeff Vandermeer's Wonder Book, and he had a much better description where he was talking about beats in general, and he sort of broke them down between action beats and sort of emotional beats and all sorts of things. Um, but essentially, I'll be reading, say, a student's work, and what more or less usually happens is that I have a student who has two characters talking, and I might have pages of dialogue, and you end up with talking heads. So I
Right.
have to go in and I have to tell the student, like, listen, I need to see some action beats here. And by action beats, I mean, we often forget when we're writing or really into a scene, especially one with heavy dialogue, that our characters, have bodies and they are inhabiting
Mm-hmm.
physical space. So I want these writers to stop and think about what are the body language between your two characters. Where are they at in this room? What else is going on in this room? How can we use setting and the way in which their bodies are physically responding to each other to sort of communicate to the reader, what is the subtext of the conversation? So
That's
I
amazing.
like to see, like I said, the physical surroundings, the physical bodies, and sometimes physical action um, in these moments in between dialogue. These breaths, these beats in between the conversation, just popping back and forth.
I agree. I think, like I say, we use them similarly. I don't think I've ever called them an action beat, but I have asked for more beats. Like, let we need a beat here, or I'll use another term, measures. Let's let this go on for another measure. And I find myself using these musical terms, and maybe I'm just weird, but I have a little bit of a musical background. I'm not exactly, I wouldn't term myself a musician, but I know enough to be dangerous. Um, and I use these terms because writing is very rhythmic.
Yes.
It's very musical, especially kind of with my background studying some poetry. The sounds of words and the rhythm of a scene, and using that to your advantage as a writer. So I'll say something like, "This dialogue goes on a beat too long. And what I mean by that is you probably have one sentence too many, or you've got too many words. Let's take out some of the words. Let's let it hit in one breath instead of in two. Um, Oftentimes I find myself asking for additional beats. Kind of like for you, it's an action beat. For me, it might be a beat of, say, stillness or silence, where you can accomplish that with an action beat, right? Where the character doesn't say anything, but instead they do something, and then the same character starts speaking later. And so that action or inaction, the choice of the character to not speak, can be represented by their action. So Jack says, "Are you mad at me?" Sally looks down at her feet. Jack says, "Come on, don't be that way." So Sally hasn't said anything. We've got a beat of silence there, but it's also an action, right? Where she's doing something, even though looking isn't interesting, it's still more of an action beat. Is that kind of how you mean it?
Yeah, yeah, I think that's very, very similar to what I'm saying. And I really love this idea that I'm going to completely steal. Um, because you're right, of sort of the musical quality of writing. It's something that we all know. I think we've even discussed before, right? The rhythmic, lyrical, and musical qualities
Hmm.
of writing.
Right.
But applying that to this idea of beats. Because, as a reader, and not even as writing teachers, right, or editors, but as readers, we sense that on the page when a paragraph does go on a little bit long, something a little too much is said, something feels a little off in sort of, the pacing
Yeah.
of what you're reading.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And that's something that I don't think everybody picks up on it, but I think the more you read and the more you write and the more you listen to music and the more you read poetry, etc., those things start to come to you. And it's a level of writing that I don't think a lot of people even aspire for, but it is something that is recognizable, even if you can't say it specifically. When you're reading somebody who understands the musicality of language, it's a very beautiful thing. And it's something that you just, the risk of sounding like overstating this, you just kind of want to wrap yourself up in it, um, kind of surround
Yeah,
yourself with it. It's a beautiful
absolutely. I think it's why, our ear in music anyway is drawn to melody.
thing.
It
Hmm.
is drawn to the um, trying to think about the right word because it is late. Um, to our, I guess, in a fumbly, clumsy way, our brains are drawn to the way the music sounds. Its evenness, its melody, the way it contrasts and complements all within the piece. You can completely tell I'm not a person who plays music.
Yeah. Well,
And I don't think writing is any different.
it's not. Think of Shakespeare, blank verse, right? He did like all his plays in blank verse for a reason. There's a reason he did that, and that it's the musicality of it, it's the rhythm, it's the beat that is ingrained in us naturally. It's the rhythm of natural speech. And I remember at one point, my father, I don't know if he remembers this or not, but he had written a line, and he came out. This is when I still lived at home. He came out of his office and he was just excited. I just wrote this line. It's the greatest line I've ever written. I might be hyperbolizing a little bit, uh, but he read the line, and I said, "Well, you like that line because it's perfect iambic pentameter." And my father's not a poet, so he was kind of looked at me and nodded and said, "Okay, sure." But being able to like identify that and hear that with the ear, that's why it resonates. And even if we do it on a subconscious level and we don't exactly know specifically why we like it, it's a lot of times just the rhythm of it. So,
I wonder if that comes from, I mean, I don't know this personally about you, but I will say that my first love, like most teenage girls probably, or I should say preteen girls, was poetry, and especially classic poetry. Not
hmm.
always rhyming poetry, of course, but all types of classic poetry. The type of stuff that you find in Norton anthologies and they teach you in school.
Uh-huh.
But I loved it.
Yeah.
And I'm still drawn to poetry. And I know that poets obviously think about the musicality and the rhythm of their writing. I mean, a really important consideration for poetry. And I'm wondering if why, as prose writers, if you're kind of equally drawn to poetry or have at least a good foundation in poetry if you have a tendency to pick that up a little bit more when you're reading.
I firmly believe that every fiction writer should spend some time studying poetry. They should teach themselves some of the basic rhythms and patterns, and they should write some poems, even if they suck. They should write some, and they should keep writing until they get a few good ones. They don't have to write a million, but the
See, I think
process
right
of
now
that.
we are like hitting on a topic that would be wonderful. We should really have some poets on, or
I
people who are
agree.
like poets and fiction writers to actually talk about. Because you just had someone on about screenwriting, right?
Yeah, yeah, I did.
Right.
I think that's a great idea. I'll put a word out to some of my poet friends, and I've got some pretty amazing poet friends. So not that I'm awesome, but they're awesome, and I met them at Antioch. So hooray for me.
But
Um,
yeah, so that we can talk about like, you know, the value I think in like reading and writing poetry when you're a prose writer.
sure, absolutely. I actually, if you're interested, have a series of blog posts out on the poetic elements in prose, um, and it's on Splickety Magazine's blog. Splickety is Splickety, splickety.com, I think is what it is, and you can find their blogs there, and you can find my posts. I've done three of them for them. I think I got one more coming out about the different elements of poetry that really go a long way in fiction. And surprisingly, I don't think I covered the rhythm in any of them, but it's more extended metaphors and juxtapositions and figurative language and stuff
Oh,
like
that
that.
would be
But
wonderful. We definitely have to do that podcast.
yeah, yeah, I agree. So, well, let's go ahead and wrap it up. Molly had a quick question before we go,
Sure.
and I thought we might tackle that real quick, and then let these people get to bed, and let me get to bed, and let you get to bed, so you're not
Mhm.
up for 23 hours. Molly wants to know, she says, what are the basic terms for characters such as protagonist, antagonist, narrator, etc.? Is it important to know these terms, and can we just say my main character or my villain? I would say if you're looking into publishing, it's absolutely imperative that you know the language. That you can, if I'm talking to you about your protagonist, you should know what I'm saying. Um, and using the language of the discipline, as it's often called, gives you a layer of credibility as a writer. So I would say that it is important. As a managing editor, Heather, would you agree with that?
I would. I would agree with that. I think overall it also just displays that you kind of take seriously what you're doing and you're demonstrating that you take it serious not just by the writing that you're putting forth, but again just your general knowledge of the terminology. I think
Right.
that when not just in regards to terms, but in just how writers approach us in general, the more that they're using the appropriate terminology, that their cover letters come across in a way that I can just tell that they've taken the time to familiarize themselves independently, right, with um,
Absolutely.
with writing and publishing.
Yeah.
And these are not hard terms to come by the definition of.
And when we were kind of brainstorming some ideas, these were the first things that were popping up when we were kind of Googling common writing terms. These are the first ones that popped up, and I think the decision that we made kind of together, maybe I just made it myself, I don't know, was these are easily Googleable, if you will. You can look it up, and you can get it's all of this stuff is covered in Making Shapely Fiction by Jerome Stern. I've mentioned that book numerous times. There's also a great book by my good friend Cindy Sproles. I co-wrote a novel with her, and she's got a quick, tiny, cheap book out there on Amazon called, I think it's called Learning the Lingo, by Cindy Sproles. You'll want to look that up, and that's just something you can get for super cheap. It's a quick way to educate yourself super fast and kind of get in touch, start making connections, because there's no one standard term. There are, some people will talk about your MC, which means your main character, while others will call it your protagonist, and others call it your protag, and it's just all shorthand and different terminology. It all means the same thing. So kind of learning the swath of those is important, but I also don't think it's difficult to do. Um, and so I hadn't planned on covering those specifically, but essentially, a protagonist is the main character. antagonist is the whatever it is that's working against your character. Um, to keep it nice and simple, your narrator is the voice of the person telling the story.
Right,
Um,
which may or may not be your protagonist.
exactly. So if you think about Gatsby, the book is really about Gatsby, but the narrator is first person Nick. Nick
Right,
is
Nick
the
Carraway,
narrator
right?
there. So, yeah.
Which
Uh,
is even to confuse things further, and is an entirely different sort of more in-depth discussion. But all of these are still also different than what I refer to as like your ethereal voice as a writer.
yeah. That's authorial, not ethereal, I'm guessing.
Yes, like author, like
Okay.
authorial.
I just
Yeah.
wanted to double check. I just wanted to double check. So, yeah, absolutely. So, excellent. Though, yeah. Well, thank you all for listening. I feel like that's pretty good. Heather, do you have anything else?
I don't have anything else other than it was great to be back tonight. I know it's been a while. I'm looking forward
Yeah.
to jumping in a little bit more often now that everything's sort of settled down.
Yeah, we definitely missed you, but we totally understand. So, um, and where can people find you? Oh, I know what I was gonna say. Didn't something just get posted?
Something did, and wow, see, you can tell it's late because I am not on the ball. Absolutely. I want to urge, all of our readers tonight to check out the latest issue of the Citron Review. It is our fall issue. It just went live 2 days ago on September 1st, and we're really easy to find. We're just at citronreview.com. So www.citronreview.com. It'll bring you right to our new issue. We have great selections of some flash fiction. We have one microfiction, some poetry, and some creative nonfiction.
I'm excited about the microfiction. I know the microfiction editor at your wonderful establishment. Um, he's a
I
good
know
guy.
him personally, and
Yeah.
he's a pretty stand-up guy. And
Yeah.
sometimes I like to double check his work, but
Yeah.
overall, I usually trust his instincts.
Wow. So
you know,
that
I really,
happened.
I really love actually the microfiction piece that you chose for this issue. I was sort of glad
Yeah.
that it came in, and we had a chance to grab it up for this issue.
Oh, I agree. Microfiction is a real tough sell, and I'm always disheartened when we go 3 months without a microfiction submission that's actually published. So, um, I was happy we got one. I got a good one, and I was super happy that we could run it. So, excited about that. So, that's where you can find Heather. Also, heatherluby.com. Yeah.
That's right, heatherluby.com, citronreview.com, and I'm also in Twitter at HD, like as in Dawn, but HD Luby. But if
Mm-hmm.
you go to my webpage, obviously I have links there that will take you directly to my Facebook and Twitter and so forth.
Exactly. Yeah, and same here. I'm at aarongansky.com. That's where you can find in the blog section. That's where you can find all of our first in fiction casts from the very beginning, way back when it was just me and Steve and one tiny microphone on a laptop computer in his office. Uh, that was fantastic. So all of those are there. If you want to look up some of our past issues that we've referenced tonight, you'll find them there. You can find me on Facebook and Twitter as well. I'm very nice. I'll friend you on Facebook. I'll talk to you on Twitter. If you tweet me, I tweet you back. So looking forward to hearing from you guys. Thanks for joining us tonight. And until next week,
Good writing.